Hi, my name is Isabelle Testoni. I've got almost 10 years experience in floodplain management in the public and private sector. I am a senior engineer at Catchment Simulation Solutions, and I'm also a member of the New South Wales Young Floodplain Managers Committee. Today I'll be talking to you about a project I did over the past year. I'd like to start to acknowledge all the traditional owners of this land and celebrating their enduring connections to country, knowledge and stories. I'd really like to pay my respects to elders and ancestors past and present who watch over us and guide us, and particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. I am particularly on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I know we're coming together from all over Australia, but I would really like to encourage everyone just to take a moment personally to acknowledge the land in which they reside. And if you're not sure, then I would encourage you to find out. I'd also just like to acknowledge my co-authors on this presentation. My colleague Tim, Katrina Robinson at the Glen Hopkins Catchment Management Authority, Dennis Rose and Nikki Hudson from the Guntidj Mirring Traditional Owners Aboriginal Corporation. So Lake Gorrie is a small lake in Western Victoria. It sits on the land of the Gunditj Marra people, the traditional owners. The original lake was used for food and water resources. Most of the lake sort of sits on this lava flow from an old volcano, so it's got a lot of trapped low points through there, and there's quite a bit of a history there of series of weirs that were established and eel traps throughout the area. So there's quite a bit of a settlement history through there of the Guntidj Marra people. The Eumeralla River sort of runs alongside of it here. And in 1932, as part of the Eumeralla Drainage Scheme, there was a drain that was cut in Lake Gorrie. So instead of the lake being filled each year and being flooded each year, it was sort of then set to flow out to deliver more water downstream. So now this is sort of resulting in the lake being sort of cropped and grazed at the moment. And it doesn't flood anymore generally. So the overall project objective was to look at restoring the cultural and ecological values of the lake. It was sort of recognised pretty early on that to do that they wanted to look at the pre-European and the existing hydrologic regimes of the lake. So flooding was sort of a large part of the values as it sort of brought in those ecological values. And sort of we have to understand what the pre-European hydrologic regimes were of the lake before we can sort of assess how we can restore the lake. But then the next part of that is looking at what options we can do to restore the lake and its proper functions. So to jump right into it, the hydrological assessment was sort of undertaken using two models. We used a hydraulic two-flow model and we used a hydrologic source model. So the two-flow model was a pretty basic setup of the model of Lake Gorrie here. It was mostly used for a stage storage relationships to then input into the source model. So the source model was of the Eumeralla River and then also Lake Gorrie on the side here. It was done this way because source can sort of run a 120-year time series is what we're sort of wanting to get out of this, so a long-term continuous simulation rather than like a short event-based model. So the model calibration was done through two different ways. First, we used the Eumeralla gauge, which was sort of a bit downstream of our catchment. So if our catchment sort of up here, it was sort of downstream of it. So it's probably not the most representative, but it had some good gauge data in there. And sort of looking for the entire model period that we had, we're sort of looking for an overall volume, no volume bias. This is because we're also looking at sort of the storage of the lake coming and going. So having that zero bias was kind of a focus of that. The second model calibration we sort of undertook was some satellite imagery. This was sort of to get the extent of the lake and looking at how much it sort of comes and goes. So you can sort of see this is sort of one event in 2019. We're sort of looking at the satellite imagery. Well, it's a bit coarse. You can sort of see that as the lake is filling, you can't really see much, but we do definitely see a bit of a formation of the lake. Yep. I'll sort of get into later in the presentation about the nature of the comings and goings of the lake. But you can sort of see it does form over a period of time and then sort of rapidly disappear. We also had discussions with the sort of local land managers, and they sort of had these observations, which was the filling of the lake, generally between July and summer every year. And there's the Lake Gorrie Road in the middle of the lake, and sort of that was being overtopped in 2015. So you can it does sort of build up quite a bit. And then sort of that backwater up through the culvert. So that's sort of these two mechanisms of flooding that the lake is seeing. So these were sort of checked in the model, and it was sort of verified with this regime coming through. So firstly, we sort of looked at, after setting up the model and calibrating, the pre-European flow regime. And as you can see, we've got two different sources of inflows to Lake Gorrie. So the Lake Gorrie is sort of here. So you've got the local catchment, so there's small local catchments coming in here and coming up here, filling the lake here. But you've also got this offtake from the Eumeralla River. So Eumeralla River is coming down here, and as it gets to a certain point, it can divert and come in and fill Lake Gorrie here. So that's also what the local land managers were saying, that sometimes it does come through here and then it sort of backwaters up and spills that way, depending on what's happening exactly. So generally the pattern of the lake was, it would, in the pre-European case, it would fill each year rapidly and then very slowly drain. So you can sort of see, this is the storage volume, just a snapshot over a decade. It fills quite a bit and then slowly sort of recedes. Because in the pre-European case there was no drain through the lake here, this was sort of all blocked, and that meant it only really receded through seepage and also through evaporation. So generally there was no actual outflow of the lake at all. Now when we get to our existing flow regime, because we've got this Lake Gorrie Road in the middle of the lake now, it's sort of cut up. We've defined this as the north arm, the south arm, and the downstream area. So after that drain had been cut, you can sort of see this is that same decade, and the sort of over the 10 years, how quickly it gets drained. You can see it still definitely does store some water, but it's a much smaller amount than it was in the pre-European case. And in some years it does get up there a bit, but nothing to what it previously was. So there's very limited storage there in the lake. And so this is the storage of just that downstream area. So there's different storages in the upstream and in the north arm. So if we're just looking at comparing the pre-European and existing lake, sort of we looked at on average, so this is the level on average that the storages would come to, and then we've mapped that here. So in the pre-European case, sort of all that green area is quite large. This is sort of based on up-to-date LiDAR, but we obviously don't have pre-European ground information, so that's the best we can do at the moment. The pre-European case, you can see, is quite a significant area that's on average filled every single year, so it's a large area and it's quite deep. In the existing case, so that's current conditions, you can see there's just small areas of trapped low points, right? So nothing too significant. So when we're looking at that full 120-year time series, we sort of looked at the number of dryouts, and that's sort of like the number of times that the lake really was dry. And in the pre-European case, it sort of goes to 63, which is almost half. And as you can see, so like every year it would be sort of be drying out. In the current conditions, in existing, you can see the north arm sort of maybe has a bit more storage, but the south arm and the downstream sort of very quickly dry out. The average areas are pretty small as well compared to the total area here. So, and the average depths are sort of not quite what the depth of the pre-European case is. So we're looking at this and we're sort of understanding that in the pre-European case, we had a much larger area inundation, and it was also quite a bit deeper. But then taking that, we sort of, okay, we can understand the differences in the lakes. It's obviously quite different now, but what does that mean in terms of our ecological values? And this is sort of where we got some help doing this. We had input from an ecologist, Dion, from Austral Ecology. And so he sort of went through what sort of vegetation classes you would have seen and you would see in the lake, in Lake Gorrie, in that sort of area. So he sort of identified these most likely EVCs, ecological vegetation classes, in the area. So you've got aquatic herbland, tall marsh, and swamp scrub. So there wasn't any survey data on exactly what is around Lake Gorrie, but these are sort of the most relevant ones that would be there. So tall marsh and aquatic herbland require quite similar hydrological conditions. So we sort of considered them to occur together, and those conditions were inundation of depths greater than 0.3 of a metre and at least 6 months with some periodic dryouts. So you want 6 months of inundation greater than 30 centimetres. Basically, then everything that was less than 30 centimetres and was wet for less than 6 months and sort of a semi-annual inundation, we classified as swampy scrub. So looking at sort of the 120-year time series, we sort of went through and did a lot of averages over that to sort of pull out what these numbers would be generally. So obviously year by year, these would change. But generally, in the pre-European case, we have large areas of deep water, which allows for sort of the tall marsh and aquatic herblands to sort of grow. In the current conditions, in the existing case, we've still got some areas that's, does get some sort of depths, but because it's all very shallow, you can only get that swampy scrub. So you won't get any of the tall marsh or aquatic herblands. Those are only in these trapped low points quite high up in that catchment. As you can see in terms of the hectares, the difference is quite significant. Yeah. This sort of then turned the focus of the project to say, great, so we know what the lake used to look like, and we sort of know what we want to get to, but what do we really want to target in that? And we sort of decided to, what we're really missing between what we have now and what was there was more of this tall marsh aquatic herbland. So we want more areas of deeper inundation. So to look at the deeper inundation areas, we sort of explored some different options. We're focusing on this south arm here because that is sort of the area owned by the IPA. So this is the area that we can focus our works in. So we sort of looked at blocking these internal drains, and so not so much there's culverts under the road, but not just blocking these drains generally to sort of stop them going through the culverts. That didn't really do very much. Then looking at raising, there's an internal, not road, but sort of the access track through the middle of it. Because it's already there, we thought maybe if you can raise that. And then we sort of looked at these internal levees, sort of. And sort of assessing them on a case-by-case basis of how much area they would make and sort of different areas downstream and how big that would be. So this is one of the options we looked at. So, we've now created quite a bit of that dark greeny area, which is that tall marsh area. So it's sort of, done a lot more of the deeper area to hopefully bring back sort of that tall marsh aquatic herbland. So this one was producing the largest flood extent. But basically to do the assessment of options, we really wanted to look at not just the amount of area, but sort of the cost of it. So the further downstream options were obviously then the more costly because we had to make the levees higher. So options were sort of assessed on the hydrological conditions restoration. So that's looking at how much water is retained and like how that compared to the pre-European case. And we looked at some of those ecological restorations. So that's sort of how much of aquatic herbland and swampy scrub we sort of saw. We did look at some economic considerations, so that's how much the levy would cost to build, and also looked at just the potential for risk to other properties. So the bigger the levy, the more likely you might impact some other properties further downstream. So this really demonstrated that the levy options were the most viable increasing Lake Gorrie, and to sort of assess them a bit, we were looking at some benefit cost ratios. But I know in flooding we look at a lot of benefit cost ratios in terms of damages and looking at, like, damages to properties. Well, this we sort of wanted to look at the benefit as being the area of tall marsh restored. So we basically just looked at the area of tall marsh restored benefits over the costs of building the levy through an assessment. So it sort of came up with these sort of numbers of like hectares per $1,000 spent, and that would be our benefit over cost ratio. So in conclusion, we found that prior to European colonisation, Lake Gorrie was a much larger lake, much more of a mix of shallow wetlands and some larger, deeper areas of vegetation. This wasn't really a surprise to us, as we sort of had that consultation with the Guntidj Marra, and them telling us that they use the land for heavy food and other resources. So that's sort of what we're thinking to find. As we're traditionally are now seeking to restore their portion of the lake to more pre-European conditions, we were sort of able to analyse different options for potential restoration and found that doing some internal levies could provide quite a bit of restoration of the lake in their area. So it really comes down to depending on the priorities, so the cost and the risk of impacting neighbours and the ecological benefit. One of the three options could be pursued further. Again, I'd just like to thank Catchment Simulation Solutions for doing this great, interesting work, and Glenn & Hopkins CMA, and the Guntidj Mirring Traditional Owners Aboriginal Corporation. It was a great project to work on, and I look forward to all your questions about it. Thanks.